Hello, and welcome to Chapter 3 in Business 110. This is all about the global marketplace. And before we kind of dive in, I want to just go over some very basic vocabulary. Imports are things that you bring into the country. Exports are things that you send out of the country. Import is in, export is out, okay? Balance of trade is if your imports and your exports, do they equal each other? You have a trade surplus if you are sending more out than in, and a trade deficit if you are sending more, what did I say? Trade deficit is if you're sending more. Export exceeds imports. I hope I got that right. Imports exceed exports in the deficit, and the surplus is when it has more exports. So trade surplus has more exports, and trade deficit has more imports. I hope that makes sense to y'all. Okay. So what we're going to do now is talk about some barriers to global trade. So for global trade, natural barriers, and these are just make sense. One of the most noticeable barriers to trade is just language. Okay, that's a natural barrier to trade. If you don't speak the language, it's awful hard to be able to trade. But there's also some other natural barriers. In soda and beer, the number one ingredient is water. So are you going to go to the Gobi Desert to bottle water and beer? Soda and beer? Probably not. It's a natural barrier to trade. You got to have water, and the desert doesn't have much water. So that's a natural barrier to trade. Now there are also some government-made barriers to trade, and one of those are tariffs. And tariff, you can probably just think about this as a tax. The government puts a tax on goods coming into the country from another country. And typically it's done to punish a country. So the United States may put a tariff of 20% for all lumber coming in from Canada. And it may do that so that the United States has a more level playing field. Because once you put a tax on it, it becomes more expensive. And the idea is that hopefully the tariff will have people buy the United States instead of the Canadian. Now, quotas are when the United States or whatever country says you have a maximum that you are allowed to import. After that, no more. So whatever the quota is, so I'm just making up something, but let's say the United States has put a quota of 1 million barrels of Canadian whiskey, okay? So once Canada has imported 1 million bottles of Canadian whiskey, it's done. There's no more coming into the United States. And that's a quota. And that also is done to give the country, the home country, a more level playing field. Because once you've imported what you can import, then you don't have a choice. You have to buy locally. There's also something called an embargo. And an embargo is basically stop. Nothing's coming in. We have a trade embargo, the United States does, on Cuba, on North Korea. We may have one on Russia now. I'm not sure with the stuff going on in Ukraine. But I know we have an embargo on Cuba and on North Korea. Nothing that is made in those countries can be sold in the United States. Amen. Turn the page. Don't even think about it. So that's what an embargo is. And rarely till you see an embargo, but it does happen. One of the other, and it's, I guess you would call it a barrier to trade, is something called dumping. And this is when a foreign country sells stuff in the United States for an extremely low price. Sometimes it's even willing to take a loss just to sell it in the United States. So the United States has done something called anti-dumping laws, so that you can't dump products into the United States. They have to have, they have to be within a certain amount. You just can't say, what was happening was countries had a surplus of something, and just to get rid of it, they were dumping it all in the United States, and the United States couldn't compete. China did this with steel. They had a bunch of leftover steel, and they were selling cheap steel, and the steel makers in the United States couldn't compete. So there are anti-dumping laws, and that's something you should be aware of. So how do you participate in a foreign market? So I have listed 5 ways. They're in your book. And these are in order of easiest to hardest, or most risky. Let's say easiest to riskiest. So exporting just means you make it in the United States, you put it in a boat, you send it to England, and you sell it there. You don't have any manufacturing in England. You don't have anything. All you do is sell it in a foreign country. So that is the easiest and less risky thing to do. Then we have licensing and franchising. And we all know what franchising is, I think. McDonald's and Burger King and all of those are franchising. When I lived in Japan, there was literally a McDonald's not that far from my house. And it was a franchise. So with a franchise, people have to sign saying they're going to run the company the way you want them to run the company. So there's a little degree of risk because they may not run it the way you want to, but chances are they will. Now, in Japan, McDonald's had like a fish burger and all kinds of different menu items, but they were still a McDonald's. You could still tell that it was a McDonald's, okay? So it's risky, but not as risky as some of the other. So contract manufacturing is when somebody, and I always get this confused, so give me a second, let me find it. A foreign firm manufactures private label goods under a domestic firm's brand. So in your book it talks about Levi Strauss entered into an agreement with Cacharel to produce new Levi's. So it's the domestic firm is Levi's, but they're entered into an agreement with the French fashion to produce new jeans. So that's a contract manufacturer. They've entered into a contract to make something for a domestic company. Joint ventures can be very risky. Typically, joint ventures are for a short amount of time. These are not long-term contracts. Your book talks about, like in China, you have to have a joint venture. You have to use a Chinese company to get your foot in the door. So you have to create some kind of contract with a Chinese company. So they're somewhat similar to licensing. The firm buys parts of a foreign company or joins with a foreign company. It's relatively inexpensive, but it's also very risky. So you see this a lot in like airplanes, like maybe 2 competing airplane companies will come together to work on the design for a new airplane. and then they'll try to build it together. Rarely do they work out, but that's kind of what a joint venture is. And then the most risky is direct foreign investment. And this is where you move lock, stock, and barrel to a foreign country and build from the ground up a manufacturing plant. All right? So you have to take into account all the things that could go wrong in a foreign country. So, let's think about it. Again, I'll ask, do you want to start a manufacturing plant in Iran? Probably not. You got to look at the political and the economic and the legal environment that you're going to be building in. I've also talked about some companies or some countries regularly deal with bribes. Is that something that you want to have to deal with? So those are some of the things that you have to look at when you start with direct foreign investment. And it's not like licensing or franchising when you can just say, okay, close it down, no more, and you just, you say, I'm done. With direct foreign investment, you have a building there. You can't just, you can close it down, but you still have those fixed assets of the building and the manufacturing plant. And what are you going to do with those? So direct foreign investment is the riskiest. It can also give quite a bit of return on your dollar. A lot of companies, there's a lot of diamonds used for industrial products. South Africa is the #1 producer of diamonds. So some industrial companies have moved their processing plants to South Africa so that they are near where the diamonds are made, so they don't have to worry about having to ship the diamonds overseas back to the United States. And it has been quite profitable for some companies. But again, you got to think about all the things that can go wrong. So from less risky to riskiest, that's the way that you get into the global markets. Hope that helps.